Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love, alongside my co-hosts Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley, and our guest is Charlie Camosy. He is the assistant professor of theological and social ethics at Fordham University. Charlie, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Charles.
Well, I wanted to talk to you about a topic that definitely can go in a lot of different directions, and it's very interesting, but we don't hear about it too often in the news unless there's some big case, and I guess every 10 years there is one. But you talk a lot, bridging the gap between religion and secularism and what's going on in the culture, but as it relates to medicine and a lot to elder care. You've written several books about, we talk about throwaway culture, and now your most recent book is Losing Our Dignity, How Secularized Medicine is Undermining Fundamental Human Equality. So tell us just a brief premise of the book, what you think the problem is and why it's important to talk about it.
Well, the basis for fundamental human equality, at least in the West for the past few centuries, has been this sense that we're all created in the image and likeness of God, that our common human nature is, in fact, what gives us fundamental equality. But since that's fallen away, especially, but not only in secularized medicine, rubber hits the road in medicine, because that's where life and death stuff tends to happen in very dramatic ways. Since that we've moved away from that, we moved to things like actualized traits like rationality, self-awareness, productivity, will, etc. And it's just very clear that human beings don't have these actualized concepts, and anything that looks like an equal measure, some appear not to have them at all. And in fact, one of the most important populations that I'm writing about in that book, I write about a lot of different ones, is in fact elders, especially our elders with dementia, who've lost rationality, self-awareness. Sometimes they don't even know their own name or really themselves or their relationships with their family, friends. And I think we're poised, as we've done in the past, to say, well, this individual might be a human being, a living human being, but they don't count as a person. They don't count as our moral or legal equals. And I think we've seen actually some pretty scary evidence of that over the last couple of years, especially during the pandemic, though it was going on before the pandemic. I don't know if you saw, but both the AP and Politico did exposés about why so many people were dying of essentially neglect in nursing homes who had dementia, but not of COVID. It wasn't of COVID, it was of neglect. Thousands and thousands and thousands of what they call excess deaths were happening. And so I wrote a book trying to sound the alarm on this, saying that when it comes to those who are in a so-called vegetative state, when it's prenatal human beings, even babies like Charlie Gard and Alfie Evans, probably remember those stories, we've just made judgments that certain human beings don't count the same as others, and we're about to do it again. At least that's my argument when it comes to people with dementia.
So what do you think the catalyst for this was? Where did it start? I mean, is it tying in, because I talk about the culture a lot and how we just minimize things we traditionally thought were important. We in fact, not even minimize, we attack things that were norms as bad. Right. And yeah, we can get into the religious argument, but it's not always the case. I mean, there are plenty, and I'm surprised, doing the podcast with that we've done and the guests we've had on, I'm meeting more of them. But before, I just assumed, like everyone else, I never met anyone, and just assumed if people were agnostic or they were atheists, that they just, didn't have the same belief system, didn't care. And they were like, well, we can just make all our decisions based on a slide rule and numbers, which isn't necessarily the case, right? So what did you see as kind of the start of the shift to kind of, changing the way we view human life?
I might give two different answers to that. One would be an intellectual one might be a practical policy one. So let me start with the practical and policy one. Right about the time we invented the ventilator, being able to, help patients breathe who otherwise couldn't breathe. And also around the same time, invented the capacity to transplant vital organs from one individual to another. There came this question, because even today and back then, certainly, that we have questions about allocation of scarce resources when it comes to vital organs, lungs, hearts, etc. And it was very clear that we needed more of them. And so what happened was, this, at least in my world of bioethics, a famous bioethics commission at Harvard was put together, the Harvard Brain Death Commission. And they decided that we would change the definition of death from a cardiopulmonary definition, essentially when your heart and your lungs stop, you're dead, to a neurological one. Not on the basis of any argument, not on the basis of any shift in how we think about ideas, but basically because they wanted to change the definition of death so we could count more people as dead, so we could take their organs and give them to others. And I say this as an organ donor myself. I can show you my driver's license if you're interested. But this was a horrible way to think about what's a good thing, organ donation, to claim that certain people are dead because we need more organs. What that essentially said is, given that so-called brain dead people can do all sorts of things that living human beings can do, including gestate children, fight off infections. I don't know if you remember the case from Jahai McMath a couple of years ago, African-American woman in California. Actually had to move to New Jersey for her parents to take care of her family to take care of her here. She was declared dead by the state of California, and then a few weeks later got her first period. She reached adolescence while she was declared dead by the state of California. So here we decided that someone who is a living, breathing, functioning member of the species Homo sapiens was not a person like the rest of us, and that is the kind of practical thing that happened. The ideological thing that happened, if you want to think about, arguments and evidence and ideas, I think does come from a kind of shift in medicine and in the culture more broadly, to say we even if you're religious, you kind of have to translate your religiosity into a different key, into a different language, even when you're talking on podcasts or on ethics committees, or you go on the evening news. Because after all, different strokes, different folks, right? We have pluralism. Who are you to impose your religion on other folks? And as a result, we haven't been able to invoke things like the image of God, or that all human beings and human nature are sharing in God's image in the same way, and that being the fundamental basis of human equality in the West. And I go into the book in some detail about how this is a very new concept that only came about with reference to Christianity. In fact, the Spanish Jesuits who came, not long after the New World was, quote, discovered, were used that theological basis for saying you can't enslave these people. Spanish people working for the Spanish crown. In fact, we're not going to hear your confessions. You're not going to be able to come to communion. You're not going to be able to do anything until you'd give up your slavery and exploitation of these people, because they share the same image and likeness of God as the rest of us. And even secular historians point to that as the birth of international human rights and fundamental human equality as we know it in the West. So when you abandon, to finish this very long point, I guess, when you abandon that theological idea, when you can't bring that theological idea to bear, the one that is responsible for the West's understanding of fundamental human equality, you really limit your options.
Well, I love Shamika like an older sister, but I got to follow that up with Will. But I did want to say one thing, as you mentioned the Oregon thing. I hadn't thought about that in years until you mentioned it. Shamika's getting a kick out of that. But I had a friend who was a doctor, and he told me he wasn't an organ donor because he's like, we are basically trained to work a little harder once we know that person's an organ donor. And I kind of blew it off when he said it, but when you said that, it made me think of that. But Will, what do you have to say about Charlie's nice intro there?
Yeah, I think it was very insightful, very well put. But I also have one practical question. And I myself am not the most religious guy in the world, but I've had this conversation with friends in my kind of background, Catholic church, with people of every sort of faith tradition. In terms of a lot of what you're describing, perhaps we've intensified this recently, but when you think about triage in the medical sector, which is a great deal of hospital care after disasters, or when you think about sort of an actuarial years of life analysis, is this avoidable? When you talk about, for example, with organ donation, you generally can't. I mean, I've had friends that were older people in the Chicago nightlife scene that have suffered fairly significant injuries and that have attempted to get on the reception list for example, a liver. And unless you are in good health, you don't have a substance abuse problem, so on down the line, you can't join those lists because the idea is that we have to make these tough decisions. It doesn't necessarily make sense to keep bringing someone back to life in a hospital facility that only has so many ER beds. You can only save so many lives. So, I mean, so the first question here, I guess, is my question is, to what degree is this avoidable? But now I'm gonna ramble on for a half minute more with some commentary. It actually seems like under COVID, we've seen the reverse of the somewhat too brutal problem or paradigm that you're describing. So, I mean, the argument that I'm a frequent flyer, I think everyone on this panel is, probably including yourself, Charles. I mean, the argument that everyone on a damn plane had to wear an N95 respirator mask was essentially just one life, right? I mean, there'd been a certain number of individuals under 60 that were not seniors that had died of COVID. And, you know, if the average business person spends 1/100th of their time doing air travel or in the airport, the total number of people that could be saved via masking, I've seen estimates of 500, 575. This was the justification for everyone who flew masking up for 2 years. So at some point, we just said that's ridiculous. Even the Democrats in power just said, well, you can mask yourself, but you can't limit an entire population of multiple millions of people to save a life. So where do you draw that line? I mean, when you talk about people that are quote-unquote brain dead, it's a tough term, but at what point, when do you open up that OR, that ER bed?
There's a lot there, and I gave you a lot. To
what extent can we avoid this as mortal beings? Like the old God and shit distinction in Catholicism. Like you might have the imago Dei. I'm sure I mispronounced that, but you might have this. I would say this is just the brain functioning, the soul, the grasp of the immortal within you. But at the same time, you're also going to die unpleasantly. So at a certain point, the hospital is going to try to push you along a little bit. If this is your 4th or 5th trip there and you have a drug overdose issue, when should they stop saving you?
Right. So my dissertation and first book was the main title of which was "Too Expensive to Treat?" ? Explicitly addressed the set of questions you just raised. So I don't think I know we can't. There's limited healthcare resources. We have virtually unlimited healthcare needs. The issue of just allocation of resources is one that's going to necessarily involve tragedy and necessarily involve us making some tough decisions. What I argued for in that dissertation and first book, and what I've argued for throughout my career, however, is that we can't and shouldn't decide that certain human beings don't count the same as others when allocating those resources. In fact, it's interesting that we decided that severely brain damaged people didn't count the same as the rest of us because we had this organ shortage. It's interesting that Alfie Evans and Charlie Gard were part of the UK healthcare system, and they decided that they didn't matter the same as all of us. I don't think it's an accident that their single-payer system focused on quality-adjusted life years as a major factor in trying to allocate their resources. So I think you're right on the money to say we have to make tough decisions all the time about allocation of healthcare resources. We have to make tough decisions all the time about costs and benefits, about speed limits and masks and a whole host of other things. But what I don't want to see happen is us kind of arbitrarily saying a whole class of people, say podcast hosts, don't count the same as the rest of us, and we can then take their organs. There needs to be some rational basis for it, not just a kind of we don't think they count the same as the rest of us because they have a disability.
That actually, I think, answers the question. I mean, when you say there has to be a rational basis for this, we sit down, we do make some kind of life years allocation. At the most basic level, though, this is sort of a classic trolley problem. Like, the distinction between people that have permanent brain damage, defined as no more brain function, not you're talking in simplified words and getting your period, don't you think that's kind of a reasonable point at which to draw the line? I mean, that if someone is not going to return to that level of sapience, and I mean, with modern brain scans, I understand there are ethical and legal issues, but you can determine that. Would you keep that person alive knowing that might even potentially cause another human to die? That's an interesting question. I would not, but I'm curious about your answer.
I guess I don't want to get in the business of saying what kind of abilities are necessary for an individual to have the same value morally and legally as anybody else. So again, there's really to talk about logic and consistency. There's really no reason for saying that Jahai McMath, who couldn't talk and had no ability to communicate, though there was some question about whether she could respond to commands or not, but did reach puberty, was very clearly a functioning human organism. Once you say it's not being human that matters, but having certain traits or abilities that matter, you really get into this game that if you're consistent, I think, I kind of make the joke that it's been St. John Paul II and Peter Singer that are the only two really people who have been consistent on this question. You either say it is all human beings that matter, or you bite the bullet and you say, well, no. If you don't have rationality and self-awareness, it doesn't matter if you're brain dead, PBS, a fetus, a newborn, if you have advanced dementia, then we just don't call you the same. You don't have the same rights as persons who count the same under the law. I don't really see, I'm open to other perspectives. I just don't see another way to go here. And that, again, to go back to your original really good point, that doesn't mean we don't make tough decisions about how to allocate resources. It just means I don't think we put classes of human beings outside the circle of equality when we do so.
I don't want to get into a long debate
go ahead.
meaning of life with the guest, but I think at some point this gets into one of the greatest questions in philosophy, which is non-arbitrary decision-making to some extent possible? And in my original field was law, and I was interested in the ethics of law. And this came up all the time. So for example, smart high school kids, every time I do a speech, will invariably say, well, there are plenty of people that are 15 or 16 or even 12 that are smarter than plenty of people that are, 18 or 22 or 24. How can you justify driver's licenses or an age of consent, which is a creepy but real question, so on down the line? And the answer is, well, because we understand that there are people that are functional and people that are not when it comes to driving a Mack truck. And we understand that something that correlates at 0.96 or whatever it is with that is age. So we set this somewhat arbitrary barrier based on age. And I think I guess you and I might not necessarily disagree on this, whether or not you think this is morally perfect. That's why we all go to confession or the equivalent, right? That is what every law in society is. You have a limited number of bids for a limited number of people. So I think in practice, almost every human society left to vote is going to come up with a somewhat arbitrary barrier that if you're not born and you're not through the first trimester of life, and this used to be called quickening by the old farm wives, abortion is possible. It's legally permissible. Almost every society that I'm aware of, down to Amazonian tribes, had a rule somewhere along that axis. Similarly with this, I think that the simple standard is that when people reach a somewhat arbitrary point of non-functionality, virtually every society is going to say there's a limited amount of money that we're going to spend or life years that we're going to lose to protect this individual simply because they have Homo sapiens DNA. We can dislike that at some level, but there also has to be that understanding that a lot of other people are going to die if you do simply keep the rule, we never ever give up on a human, meaning someone with Homo sapien fertilized DNA.
Yeah, to be clear, I'm not saying that I don't know what you mean by give up on a human necessarily. I do think removal of life-sustaining treatment is totally legitimate in many circumstances, as long as one is not saying we're doing it because they no longer count as one of us, or they don't have the same value as we do, or something like that. And I agree that even if you go in my direction and the direction before Harvard 1969, the Brain Death Commission, you have to come up with a policy that is going to be somewhat arbitrary. For instance, the cardiopulmonary criteria for death still has you still have to draw the line, and you say, well, certain people have been resuscitated after 45 minutes or an hour. If you wait 45 minutes or an hour, the chances of you getting a healthy set of lungs or a healthy heart to donate into somebody else's body is very, very low. So we tend to go with 2 minutes or 5 minutes or something like this. And there are questions I think we need to ask about this. But eventually, as you're pointing out, from a policy perspective, you kind of have to draw the line. But I think that's quite different from saying, well, how many quality adjusted life years or how much what kind of IQ do you have to count? What level of speech, what level of recognition of your family do you have to have before we start saying you don't count the rest the same as the rest of us?
Well,
fair points. Fair
yeah,
points
well,
on
go
all
ahead,
sides.
what were you saying?
Well, I just said, yeah. I mean, I engaged that for like 10 minutes. So obviously, can't keep going with thread. I just said good points on all.
Well, I wouldn't want to cut you off, though. I mean, you were flowing so well. We'll come back to you, though.
Yeah.
I have an idea, but I mean, Shamika's just sitting there, and I'm interested in knowing what she's thinking. So let's go to Shamika first. Shamika, what would you like to add?
Well, I like to listen and just make little notes in my own mind. And one of the things I was thinking about as I hear you all talk about organ donation, and there's this bumper sticker that says something like, don't take your organs to heaven. Heaven knows we need them here. And my bumper sticker would be like, nah. If I go, they're gone. I'm not an organ donor, and simply for conversations, I am fearful that if something were to happen to me, bad accident or something, they may not work as hard to keep me here because I show on my, license that I donate my organs. So my family always told me not to put that on your license. And I've told my kids that I don't know very many people in my family or circle that are organ donors for that reason. And maybe that's like a little myth, but that's for that reason we don't put it on our license. I want you to work as hard as you can to keep me here for as long as I can, as long as I'm kind of cute. Now, if something happens to me and I'm missing limbs and my face is all smushed in, go ahead and let me try to come back as something else.
See, Will, there you go with those parameters we must set around things to decide. So she's like, see, not being cute is a good enough reason not to resuscitate.
Well, I think in practice, though, as Charles said, the standard you're going to use isn't going to be like, we kill the ugly people. The issue he's describing, I think, is the tough one here. What about when you get people that are declining in terms of functionality? I think the arbitrary standard there would have to be something like a scan of the brain to see whether it functions or will function again. But I do think you would see outrage from most people in a hospital setting, especially kind of a British NHS hospital setting, if a decision was made to, say, resuscitate or give an emergency bid to someone who happened to be literally brain dead, not early onset dementia or something like that, but brain dead, quote unquote, the traditional sense, as opposed to someone who was not. So I guess the question is, if you're in any situation, this might be the ethical standard, where a life is at risk or a certain number of life years are at risk, are you going to draw no distinction between, say, the brain dead person and the typical citizen? And I think the hard trad position, even in the Catholic Church, might be, well, you shouldn't. Anyone that's a human has been touched by God or whatever the idea might be, and so all of them should be treated equally. In practice, virtually no societies do that. You could call this good, you could call that bad. We are far from the perfection of the heavens here. But, I mean, that is a reality. Like, possibly last comment for me in the next 20, 30-minute block, but I was once talking with an actual philosopher. Shamika doesn't believe it at all, but I was once talking with an actual philosopher, and I mean, as I understand, Charles is a theologian, but I mean, his comment was, if you actually put in place a ban on any termination of fertilized human DNA, I don't think you guys on the American right understand what that would mean. I mean, that would mean a total ban, not just on abortion, but on Plan B and similar pills. That would end all in vitro clinics where fetuses are often terminated. I didn't know that, but actually it's the case on a massive scale. That would end all mercy care for coma patients, which is exactly what we're talking about here. That would end stem cell research. I would not opt to do that. I mean, there has to be a barrier somewhere, perhaps arbitrary, between stem cell and your grandfather.
Charlie, I know you want to respond. But I was going to, but then when he added the last piece, it made me think about what I wanted to say, and maybe you can tie the two together. Because, and it's not an attack on that, it's like, I'm sure the point of the book was slightly different, but when I read Secularized Medicine, my concern is, obviously you're talking about, in some of your examples, I mean, you talk about brainwaves and things about that and things like that, but you're talking about like pulling the plug on people, or when somebody reaches the level of dementia that they don't remember anything, and people just say, well, how good is their quality of life and things of that nature. But I have another thing. When I hear that, I'm thinking not secularized in the sense that, why don't we have this, religious approach to things as we used to. But I do think that there's a cultural shift that I talk about all the time. And obviously, there's a political layer on that, and everything's so partisan. So when I see that, I think of Will's not wrong in saying that we have to have something that we use, because even in his example of the Catholic Church, everyone's equal, but somebody had to get there first. It's got to be something that you're using. But beyond that, if we decide that we have to set some parameters, and we agree with Will, we need to set them, rationally, and this is what the guide we're going to use. I'm not sure the way our culture is now, and Shamika can talk to this later because I think she agrees with me, because the culture has gone so bad, I don't think we're capable of setting honest, true, fair parameters around what we would do. I mean, somebody's politics will get in. Like he just said, the philosopher he spoke to said, you people on the right don't really understand what that would limit. And then other people will say, well, as a liberal who thinks people should be able to do what they want, I want to limit these, but not these people. Or libertarians will say, I'm taking a hard line on this. I just think we're at a place where everybody cares about what they believe and what they feel, and it is right and everyone else is wrong. We don't really compromise. So I don't even say, when I hear that medicine, I'm thinking the government and the people in the medical profession are going to make decisions, and they're not really going to take into account all of these things that you write about in your book that Will may think about that's different than what I may think about, and take them together as a whole. They'll just say, well, I went to medical school, so I think this, or I am the governor, I am the judge, so this is what I think. That is really my biggest concern, is that the person making, or the groups making decisions, may not really be thinking about all of the patient's best interests, or whatever else the case may be. So what do you think about that as an approach?
Yeah, I really think, you said a lot of very wise things there, and I realize it's maybe odd for me to say this as the white guy on the panel or the show, but it's very clear that U.S. African Americans are deeply concerned about this and how they approach medicine. I don't know if this is in Shamika's background when she's talking about, you don't put yourself down as an organ donor because you never know how this is going to shake out when you have people working on you. There's deep distrust, especially at end of life, from African Americans of the medical community in comparison to how white folks think about this. So race is a part of it. Ability, ableism is a major part of it, and that's where I am kind of stamping my flag in the book, is trying to say ableism is not where we should be at all on this, and that again, I think it's pretty condescending of that philosopher to say that Christian pro-lifers haven't thought through the implications of our position. This is like, we've been thinking about this for like 2,000 years, and there have been multiple centuries of swings in the thought about this, where quickening was part of the story. Ensoulment has changed as a significant marker over the centuries, over the millennia. I engage with philosophers all the time. In fact, when I debate Peter Singer publicly, he says, "Are you sure you don't want me to introduce you as a philosopher? Because if I introduce you as a theologian, people are going to have a different view of your perspective here." But here, as a shift, getting back to Charles's point about how these things are perceived culturally, here's a really important shift in how the culture has thought about Down syndrome. I don't know if you guys are familiar with, at least in my world of bioethics, the baby Doe case is like the case that kind of got maybe even bioethics off the ground. It happened in the early 80s in a very interesting political time, that basically the baby Doe had Down syndrome, and was born. The parents and the medical team decided they didn't want her to live, and she had something called esophageal atresia, and was easily treatable. And the doctors and the medical team and the parents decided not to treat her, and she died simply because she had Down syndrome, not because of esophageal atresia, which was easily treatable. And there was a massive uproar that had strange bedfellows in it, which I think we could still have today. It was anti-ableism, disability rights groups, and pro-lifers lobbied the Reagan administration to just hammer any neonatal intensive care unit that would have, or any pediatric unit, or any medical unit at all that would act like this, to say this is aiming at the death of a disabled person. You maybe didn't attack them with a sharp object, but you aimed at their death by omission. You decided it was no longer time for them to live because they had a disability. You wouldn't fix this easily fixable problem. Fast forward about 30 years, and now I probably don't need to tell you there are bills in both Maryland and California right now which are trying to protect parents' rights to not treat children in the neonatal intensive care unit. Not because of, overburdensome care or something like that, but just because the parents decide they don't want them. In an overwhelming number of cases, it's because of a disability. So I just had an article published tonight on this, actually, at the Public Discourse, if people are interested to learn more about my arguments about this. So in a matter of 30 years, we went from actually putting red phones in neonatal intensive care units so that nurses or others could get federal investigators to come in and say, no more baby Doe cases, right? To now having legitimate arguments about whether parents can and medical teams can choose to not treat babies because we don't like their disability. And I probably don't need to tell the three of you about the abortion rates for babies with disability. Like for Down syndrome, it's like close to 90% in some cases in some countries. In the United States, estimates differ, but it's between 60 and 90%. So Charles, your point about we got to draw the line, but then how do we think about how the cultural forces in play would push that line, and think about that line. That's where I'm pushing in the book. I'm saying of course there has to be a line. Of course there does. But it shouldn't be one based on ability. It shouldn't be one that says certain human beings matter less because they're disabled. Certain human beings matter less because they don't have certain qualities like rationality, self-awareness, IQ, life years to live, etc.
Did you have something you wanted to add? Shamika, go ahead.
I have a question. Isn't there a type of dementia that is very progressive? One moment you may know how to walk and then tomorrow you may not. And you slowly deteriorate just forgetting how to do simple things, even swallowing or, in those situations, because I know someone who kind of just went through it about a year or two ago. Do you just kind of continue to progress till your brain doesn't function at all? Or is that a choice of the family or the medical doctor to say, okay, they're not coming back because they've been progressing, all of this time? Do they just progress into death, or is that a choice of the family that just says, okay, this is it, let's take them off because they now have forgotten how to do everything, breathe, whatever?
Well, it's very rare they forget how to breathe, but it is fairly common that they forget, again, their name, the relationship with their loved ones. They lose the
swallow,
eat.
They can't.
Yeah, then most of the cases like that they're already in the dying process. If that's the case,
Okay.
I'm thinking more about cases where they're clearly not dying. Right, they're living members of the species Homo sapiens. You could, from a certain biological perspective, you could say they're living just like the rest of us are, but they're profoundly impaired. They're profoundly disabled, and in our culture, which tends to prize what you can do, right? How many times have you heard what I've come to see as an awful phrase, productive member of society? They're no longer productive members of society, but in fact are net burdens, if you just want to be harsh about it, net burdens on society, their family, on the community, on the healthcare system. It's very easy for a culture that lives in that kind of ableist world, consumerist world, productivity obsessed world to say, how much we really should be putting into this individual, right? I'm trying to push back on that from the perspective of a explicitly theological point of view that says none of that matters for anything in terms of how we think about their fundamental moral legal status, or it shouldn't anyway.
I have one thing to say. This is very random and not on topic, but I feel like I need people to know this that may be watching on YouTube. I don't smoke crack or anything like that. You keep seeing me scratch because I just came from a soccer game and I feel like I've been outside for hours. So every time I scratch, I'm just thinking gosh, I hope they don't think I do crack. But anyway, I've been outside. I feel like, the little gnats and bugs are all over me. I didn't get a chance to shower before the podcast. I wanted to let you all know that.
I don't think anyone noticed you scratching, but we're going to go back and check that now. But
it's been a lot.
Actually, everyone has weird quirks like that. I cracked the bone in my elbow, whatever it's called, playing basketball 6 or 8 months ago, and I worry that my hands look shaky and I'm getting weaker in the gym.
Right, and sometimes I smoke crack. That's my weird.
Okay. And Charles actually is a crackhead. He gets down with the pipe. Okay, so we all have our little vices.
That's my weird quirk.
I put the pipe away in honor of Charles's podcast. So.
I was talking about the other Charles, Dr. Camosy. You said you smoke crack?
No, I was saying that I put the pipe away for the podcast. So.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. Actually, there was a great Welsh TV interview recently where this feminist journalist was giving an interview. Did you guys see this? And I'll keep it PG with the religious man on the show, but she had this giant self-pleasure device on the bookshelf. It's 14 inches long. I think it was a black one. And she's talking very sincerely about women's rights and there it is. It's just very awkward. It's something you can't play off. She also had a whip, I think. So she had the dildo and then the whip and then very much yes, in England we've made some progress, but there's quite a lot to be done when it comes to incorporating female Muslim religious minorities into society. So anyway, there's always someone worse off than you. That's the point. One thing
in the age of libs of TikTok, we can't be shocked anymore. So, but
well, that's actually, that's an interesting side debate in and of itself. The libs of TikTok and Taylor Loren's story, what the media should do, since we're talking about ethics. But one question I have for you, Charles, the non-crack one, is basically it sounds like a lot of this is very explicitly religious, and of course that's appropriate in your professional and professorial role when you talk about ensoulment and so on. But as you said, some of these things, we're becoming a secular, warlike, less godly society. It's a capitalist society. We're allowing this. I will say, in a good political science program, you take some courses in background anthropology and so on. And most societies have had to make these decisions. Many societies, frankly, in Native America, if you were no longer able to fight and you progressed past the point where you were a burden on the tribe, you'd be sent off into the woods to be eaten by wolves or bears. So I actually don't think we've done a worse job of dealing with these questions than many people have. In fact, the richer the society is, until you get into the national health sort of communist light space, the better, in your terms, these decisions tend to be handled. At some point, I noticed that when you say things like a member of species Homo sapiens are capable of some basic physical function, you seem to be referring to people that are, in normal terms, for example, brain dead. So I think very few societies before ours would have even considered simply allowing those people to survive forever on the public dime. So it is important to note that that's what we're discussing. My question, though, is a little different from this. Is there a non-religious justification for this? If you don't believe in souls, what would the argument be that if someone wants to die per some written statement or some such, and has no brain function, they should be encouraged or forced to live? Absent the touch of God, is there a practical argument against the years of life or quality of life argument?
Well, I think I can tie both your comments together. So I would agree that we're in a different situation than the cultures you just described, and it's precisely because of our Judeo-Christian heritage that we are. So we are a culture that can imagine God creating us equal, and that we're endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights, and that this can be traced historically all the way back again to the Spanish Dominicans, who told a group of Spaniards a very, at the time, unthinkable thing, but just as unthinkable as today we think of someone who is so-called brain dead as not one of us. It's a very strange idea, I admit, to many people's intuitions, but it follows, I think, logically from the kind of anthropology that we've had since that anthropological vision won out. And so, yes, I affirm your point that other cultures, especially those who aren't formed by this Christian anthropology, have been and are still today in a very different position than we are. But my argument in the book is to say that since the 60s, since the secularization has kicked in, especially in the professions and especially in the medical profession, we've been on this slide where we're losing the basis for this. And then we end up in a situation where we replace it with things like quality adjusted life years or something like that as a criterion. Now, do I think, obviously there are some, a very small minority of secular folks who have this anthropology. But when pressed, I'm not sure how they justify it, right? I'm not, if you just ask them all the way down to their foundational beliefs, it's not clear that they have a justification for it. In my view, they've kind of absorbed it from the culture, that is, again, formed by this Judeo-Christian anthropology. It's just kind of in the bones of who we are as a culture. But yeah, so I guess I have the hardcore theological belief that it's not the touch of God or something, but a very explicit creative act to imbue us with his own image and likeness that is the foundation of fundamental human equality, and that if you reject that, there is no basis for fundamental human equality. I mean, if you anything else you're going to choose, human beings differ in how they have it, and that, as our discussions already surface various human populations who wouldn't count the same as others once you abandon that foundational anthropological vision.
Isn't that just the natural rights versus the civil rights perspective, though? I mean, the other great Western tradition was the idea that, of course, there's some rights in nature, the right to self-defense, perhaps to labor, but that the rights we have, such as the right to vote, explicitly come from the individual society. So, I mean, there actually is a pretty, I didn't expect to have this conversation in the podcast, but there's a pretty eloquent defense of the arbitrary vision out there. We have the rights we have in society. The most important may be the right to vote or the right to bear arms, because the society grants them. So at some point, some human being, whether or not inspired by the Lord, sits down and writes the law. And I don't think any of us favor killing elders with mild dementia. There tends to be a major consensus among the sane people in society, but some people are going to be left out of that. I mean, I don't favor banning Plan B. So we have the rights we have as humans because we gave them to one another in society, is the response.
I mean, that's a pretty tenuous basis for foundational rights, and it's certainly not the one that our founders and framers had, right? Which talked about them coming from God and them being inherent, not offered. In fact, I mean, this is I'm not a person of the right, but for those who are, this is a classic articulation of the religious right, saying our rights come from God, not from humanity, not from cultures. That's just an arbitrary thing, and of course, the society can say, who gets the right to vote, on what kind of basis. There's been tremendous injustices to which we, have rightly appealed to a different vision of foundational rights.
To some extent, there are massive limits on the right to vote. That's what I happen to write about. I mean, for example, highly intelligent 17-year-olds can't vote.
Right, but obviously when you say women or African Americans can't vote, the appeal there is to, inherent human rights given by God.
Okay, I guess the one final question in this sequence is, it's stupid to ask a question like, would you let brain-dead people vote? So I won't. But I mean, for example, would you favor extending the vote to, for example, everyone over 12 because they are human? Or the right to bear arms?
Of course not. I don't think that's a fundamental human right, though.
Well,
I don't know about that's. I think at some point there's a massive element of arbitrariness that goes into all this, and this is something that's always struck me during philosophical and theological debates. The idea of what is a fundamental human right itself is to some extent socially defined. Yeah. Hey, Jane. Who receives these rights is to some extent socially defined. Who a human is. I don't think, for example, Dr. Camosy, would you ban Plan B, for example? Anything that terminates human life?
I can show you a long article I've written on how Plan B doesn't really impact embryos, if you're interested in that. So no, I wouldn't ban it.
What if it did? What about the other pills that do remove something from the uterine wall? Like, is that a human?
I guess I go with the biological position here, which is we're fellow members of the species Homo sapiens, and that's what bears God's image and likeness. The fact that and again, going back to the Spanish Dominicans telling the Spaniards colonizing the New World that the people they were enslaving mattered exactly the same as they did was just as absurd a notion, right? And so we have to get beyond those kind of cultural those cultural limitations to just follow our principles wherever they take us. And at times they're going to take us to what seems to be an absurd position, but it's often absurd on the basis of something other than a kind of rational application of a principle.
Yeah, I want to say something. We talk about going back to where this came from, and I know Will is just making, logical assertions to say, well, what about this? More on the basis of how do we figure out how to do this? But when he mentioned the guy the philosopher he spoke to, it kind of lends itself to another group of people who are more doing this in an antagonistic fashion towards religion, and they kind of think, like he even opposed it, saying, the guy said, well, the people on the right and if you
really understood your position, you would think this. Yeah.
Right. But my thing is, what a lot of, and this push, against religion, saying, like, people will say religion caused all these problems, and obviously you got people, whatever their religious views are, these are people you're talking about, and they're all flawed. But what's lost a lot on that, and I think you've talked about this before, I don't know if it's in a recent book, is that, and I like to point this out because it's important, like, they make it seem like these religious people don't really care, or they have a really extreme, rigid view of morals, of medical practices, of what we should do, and kind of make it seem like they don't care, because if you don't fit in this box, it doesn't matter. But they ignore the fact that many of the charities and many of the hospitals and many of the medical practices we have today came from people based on their religious backgrounds, right? So talk about that and why that's important, and how it kind of speaks to what they're saying about the religious people don't really understand how important some of this stuff is.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'll answer your question. I don't want to suggest that there's not dark periods of history. Anybody who's been even mildly educated in the history of religious thought and the history of religious institutions knows that there are black periods in our history, and we need to take full account of those. That said, You're totally right. I mean, if you just look at the history of healthcare in this country, you can't separate it from religious institutions. And I say this as a proud Catholic theologian, from Catholic institutions in particular. I just finished a book that's coming out this summer on nursing bioethics, and a big part of that book was to show that the primordia of contemporary nurses don't come from Nightingale. They come from Catholic nuns who actually taught Nightingale everything that she knew. And then Catholic nuns were largely responsible for creation of the first hospitals in the United States. I think they were the first actual nurses to work in the Civil War. I think there's some distinction. I talk about this in this new book, that Catholic nuns actually ferrying troops up and down, wounded soldiers up and down various rivers. They got a posthumous award for that. Looks like we've lost one of our illustrious members here. Hopefully he comes back. Hopefully he comes back. And
doesn't like what you're saying.
And yeah, he doesn't. And still today, 1 in 6 beds in the United States in a medical setting are in a Catholic institution. And then beyond that, there's plenty of other religious institutions that aren't Catholic that also have a lot of health care. So again, not trying to cheerlead here, not trying to go beyond what the record shows. There's lots of negative to point to as well. But the idea that religious institutions don't care is just ridiculous. I mean, the amount of resources that religious institutions have put into healthcare of the most vulnerable especially is really, really prodigious.
And charity and poverty and all that. And of course it's wrong. There's nothing wrong with calling out what's wrong. I just feel that it's always this negative thing. It's like, look at these people, from how they vote to what they do to racism to history to slavery. It's all this negative. And they act like there is no positives involved. Like everything, that any religious people, the religious people of America, people with religious views have just totally destroyed America, and they've contributed nothing, right? And that's just basically kind of whether we talk about culture, where the culture is gone, and that's all we get. So we're going to teach, true history, not, 1619 history. Then we need to point out, the positives and what that holds in addition to the others. But unless Shamika will want to add something to that, I do want to ask you a bit about elder care, since that's one I think you talk about a lot. But Shamika, did you have anything you want to say? Are you still soaking it in?
No, I didn't have anything I wanted to say, but once you get to elder care, I do want to know if you've seen the movie I Care a Lot.
Can't say that I have, I'm sorry.
I haven't either.
You should watch it. It's very good. It's about elder care.
Oh, okay. Will, you look like you're thinking before I go into elder care. Were you going to say something?
Oh, no. I mean, I've gone back and forth with Charles about some of these points.
Right.
And I agree with a fair amount of what he has to say. The one thing I will say, I actually agree with that last comment on
Shamika's laughing. No, we're laughing because you're laughing.
She's laughing. That's
no, I
the
don't
one thing I'm going to say.
But the one thing...
It's really like a 30-second note. Like, I do think that this is actually a pretty important point. Religion in the United States, for some reason, is almost entirely presented in a negative light. This actually has nothing to do with most of my earlier arguments. I mean, there are a couple of studies that find that when you see a priest in a movie, they're almost always the villain. They're like the crooked reverend conjuring up demons, or they are perverse in some way. They're having a sexual affair with a good lady of the church as like a sworn father. And yeah, I mean, obviously religion has, and I think it's interesting that both of you guys found it necessary to say that. Like, of course, religion. What's up?
I said, isn't that like almost true though?
See what I'm saying?
I think that's more true with Protestant pastors, actually, in my experience. But that's a little beside the point. The comment, though, is just that, of course, I think we all recognize that religion's been responsible for fairly evil things. I think religious people, for whatever reason, have done a fairly poor job of bringing up the flip side, the Red Cross and Red Crescent and so on down the line. I mean, the beginning of modern charity, the building of the cathedrals and the classic architecture. So, yeah, of course there's a case for religion. I think one of the issues in our society right now is that a lot of people have heard so much critical theory, they've never heard any theory. They've never heard what was being criticized. So they haven't heard the Greek or Roman or Aquinan or Augustinian arguments. All they've heard is a bunch of people kind of throwing crap at them. And that's actually a big problem. That's pretty much my one comment on this.
I would go even further. You talk about, learning that, that's a big step. I would argue, you mentioned the Red Cross. I would argue that most people today, if you ask them, don't think that was a religious organization.
Even though it literally it says Red Cross. I mean,
they just think it's just some group that with the people with the red buckets. Trust. I don't know. I mean, the Salvation Army, Red Cross, they just think they're just some organizations that help out. They're just a charity. Some guy in his garage just said, I'm going to start this charity because, I was poor or something. They don't connect.
The reason for this is that Marxists have been writing our history for most of the past 60 years. That's actually a big feature of my next book, like where the textbooks come from. This is all very real. Everyone during the 1950s was accused of being a Soviet spy by McCarthy and those boys. If you read the Venona Cables, was a Soviet spy. So this is a real problem. I mean, it's to some extent a rot within the society that we don't understand our own foundations at all. So there's that.
And you're right that my final call to battle, as it were, at the end of the book is to say it's time for Christians to stop being embarrassed about this history and to trumpet it more and to be confident. Not again papering over the bad, but being confident about the good as well. Right.
So I guess we got to, like I said, elder care. You talk about how, dimensions going up. Elders care is important, but also, like I mentioned to you before, is because the number of people that fall into that category is going to grow as the boomers become senior citizens. You get so many more people. People are living longer, far longer than before, some ebbs and flows in the last few years. But that doesn't mean that they're all going to be living and walking around at 80 and 90 in perfect health either. And then talk about if there's anything in your writing. Unfortunately, like I said, didn't get to finish the book. But talking about like how this is manifesting itself across the world, because we always hear you should treat your elders better. We don't treat our elders like the black community might be like the next generation. Sometimes grandma moves in, but as American society we don't. But look at how Japan and how Chinese people treat their elders and all that kind of stuff, which is partially true. But then there's also countries that are far ahead of us in euthanizing people in certain categories.
That's right.
So talk about where you think elder care is going, and obviously you think a lot of it is going to be problematic, but what we need to do in order to, kind of stop it before it gets any worse.
One of the things, somebody who lives in New Jersey and works in New York, I encounter a lot is if people make the mistake of asking me about what I'm writing on or thinking about. And I talk about this issue. They say, one of the things as an immigrant to this country I still haven't got used to is how you treat your elderly. And it's so interesting that you point to African American communities as being resistors of this, and I think that's exactly right. We could really use models for how to do this differently, but especially in other communities, and especially in fairly middle class or affluent white communities. I don't need to tell you, the practice is to essentially put your loved one in a warehouse until they die. And this has obviously come to fore during the pandemic in ways that we can no longer claim ignorance about. The kind of things that happened both in New Jersey and New York in nursing homes.
Yeah, because Cuomo was killing them.
It was a literal throwaway culture. My last book was on throwaway culture, Pope Francis's idea of that. And I mean, it was really treated exactly as Pope Francis describes it. It's essentially excess baggage to be discarded to make sure that hospitals had the kind of censuses they wanted instead of the censuses they didn't want. And that is part of our culture more generally, right? You tend to think of things, again, with exceptional communities like many African American and immigrant communities. Say, I don't want to be, and it's true of the boomers themselves. It's true of my own parents. They've told me, they're back in northern Indiana. They said they don't want to be burdens on us, on the three kids, right? We got one kid in California, one in DC, and one in New Jersey, New York. I'm scared to death. They're in their, mid 70s. They're healthy now, but how long will that last? So I'm not here to kind of pontificate from my own perspective on this. I've been that kid who went off and did my own thing without thinking about what would happen to my mom and dad, without thinking about how I should be there for them as they were for me. One of my favorite all-time popular articles in bioethics was in First Things by Gilbert Mylander, the title of which was "I Want to Burden My Loved Ones." And he talked in a very moving way about how his kids burdened him, but it was a great joy as well as a burden. It was a great privilege as well as a burden, and that we owe that same. If the fourth commandment means anything, honor your father and mother. It doesn't just mean not taking the cookie from the candy jar when they tell you or whatever. It also means being there for them in their final months and years and days. And what we've done is create a horrific system which was exposed during the pandemic, and now we're without excuse. In particular, we're to draw the dementia thing into this. I'm sorry for the overly long answer here again, but the number of people with dementia that died in nursing homes during the pandemic was extraordinary. It had nothing to do with COVID. The number of people with dementia is going to double in the next 20 years, it's going to triple in the next 30 years. We're already, New York Times did an expose showing that about anywhere between a fifth to a third of patients or residents with dementia in nursing homes are given antipsychotic drugs, even though they have no psychosis, simply to keep them docile because they don't essentially have the resources to care for them. In fact, during the pandemic, one of the most horrific stories I saw was a patient with dementia just wandered out of the nursing home and froze to death overnight, and nobody knew that they were gone or found that they had left. So we have this gets back to Will's point about allocation of resources. We have a choice to make. Do we want to put the resources into care for this population or don't we? And that's what I'm arguing for in the book. We have to choose to treat this population like our equals. If not, the two options we really have available to us are so-called robot care or euthanasia, because I think the current way we're doing it will just be seen as totally unacceptable. In fact, it already is.
Well, the book is Losing Our Dignity. He is Charlie Camosy, Associate Professor of Theological and Social Ethics at Fordham University. Charlie, thank you for joining us.
No, it was my pleasure. Thanks for the fun discussion and arguments, too. The US of A, land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.